This is the Farm Voices podcast, sharing information about regenerative agriculture, climate resilience, and agricultural policy in the United States. I'm Kevin Castle, speaking this afternoon with Elizabeth Henderson, farmer, author, activist, and leader in organic farming and farm policy. Hi, Elizabeth. It's great to speak with you today.
Hi, good to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me.
You are a recipient of the Northeast Organic Farming Association's Lifetime Achievement Award, along with numerous other awards and distinctions. You've written extensively on organic farming, including the books Sharing the Harvest, A Citizen's Guide to Organic Farming, co-written with Robyn Van En, and Whole Farm Planning, Ecological Imperatives, Personal Values and Low Input Practices in the Northeast with Karl North. Can you share a little bit of your background with farming?
Well, I had a previous life as a teacher of Russian language and literature, and I got tired of being in schools, so I decided that I would become an organic farmer. Actually, my first plan was to homestead and to teach with a prison education program that provided college degrees for political prisoners like Black Panthers or SDSers. But funding for that got cut. And by that time, I had discovered that I really enjoyed growing food. And so it was a way of living that would keep me in line with my values. And that's always been very important to me. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons I left academia. Academia has been very much on display lately for its horrible behavior in relation to students who are protesting the extermination of the Palestinian people by the Israeli government.
Mm-hmm. And you, if I recall correctly, established the first CSA that was west of Albany as you expanded your farming operation.
Our CSA was maybe second or third in New York State, and it was the first west of Albany. Mm-hmm. No one had heard about joining a community-supported agriculture farm, paying in advance for receipt of food. It was a totally new idea. But with the help of Allison Clark and the Politics of Food in Rochester, we were able to get our CSA started over the winter of 1988-89. And the people who joined were Rochester's peace activists, environmentalists, people who understood the value of supporting a local organic farm. And so these days, when I go to demonstrations for peace or for mitigating climate change, I see people whom I fed and their children who are now grown up and their children. So I was feeding the right people. Very, very satisfying. Mm-hmm.
In addition to the skilled and technical work required of farmers and ranchers, as food producers and as land stewards, organic and small to medium scale farmers and ranchers are also tasked with making the business model of growing healthy food work. So given your background with the development of your CSA in a novel location and all of your expertise, I'd like to talk about that. Why are the financial margins for small and medium-sized farms so slim?
Well, this country is dedicated to a cheap food policy. So in order to keep the masses of the people well-fed and quiet, our government will go to great lengths to make sure that food is inexpensive. And since the whole global food system has come under corporate domination after World War II, and there was a departure from the system that brought family scale farms out of the Depression, which was parity payment with supply management, so that the buyers had to pay prices that covered the costs of production for the farms. And if the farms had to cut back on production in order to limit the supply so that the price would go up, that's what happened. But since the 50s, that system has been completely ended. In its place, taxpayers pay money to support crop insurance for farmers, but the buyers get off with a very good deal. So they are paying often less than it actually costs to produce the food, and particularly not the costs to produce food using ecological methods and food of the highest quality. So that's what makes it extremely hard to make a living as a family scale, community-based organic farmer in this country or anywhere in the world. It's really a struggle for existence between the smallholders and corporate domination.
Mm-hmm. And when you say the buyers of the food, do you mean individual consumers, or are you speaking of a different system of distribution?
About the big buyers.
Okay.
There are fewer and fewer of those big buyers. That's the consolidation that has taken place. So in all the major sectors, there are 4 to 6 dominant corporations dominating groceries, chemical production, equipment production, distribution, pork, beef, chicken. So farmers don't have very many choices as to who to sell to, and or who to buy from. And that's why when I started farming, I tried very hard to develop the model of community-supported agriculture so that there would be a really effective way of direct sales, cutting out the middle people. And Booker T. Watley down in Tuskegee Institute had the same kind of idea. He was struggling to solve the same problem. How do you keep small-scale farms, particularly farms of people of color, in business, given the limits when it comes to selling to bigger entities? So cutting out the middlemen is a great way to do it. But still, most people buy through middlemen of different kinds, from food services, restaurants, retail stores, groceries. And so in order to make that system work better, NOFA is a part of the HEAL Food Alliance, and together with the food chain workers has been working on the Good Food Policy Program, which would allow institutions to pay more for values-based foods. That is food that comes from either organic, BIPOC managed, local farms that treat their animals humanely, farms that provide living wage jobs for the people who work on them.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else we need to know about policy or financial incentives that are actually working against small and medium-sized farms?
Well, the largest portion of federal farm policy is not aimed directly against small farms. Instead, it supports the industrial scale farms. So ending those benefits for the industrial scale farms and the unlimited access to use of whatever chemicals they want to use would level the playing field.
Mm-hmm. And again, those industrial-sized farms, you said, are selling to distributors or middlemen who are purchasing the food product at a loss for the farmer. So that's all being subsidized by the taxpayer.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the crops produced in this country actually don't go for food for human beings. The corn and the soy are feed for animals or feed for industrial processes, ethanol or highly processed ingredients in highly processed foods that are very unhealthy for the people who eat them. So that whole system has got the biggest farms really caught. They don't have very many choices to go some other direction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we have to change.
And that's interesting to go on a bit of a tangent, but related to what you just said. We have many people in this country who are food insecure, who are not having enough food for their children, for their families. But you're saying that a lot of this food is actually not for human consumption.
Right.
So we potentially could have enough food or do have enough food, but we need to reprioritize hunger.
We absolutely do have enough food at the present moment to feed everybody an ample diet.
Mm-hmm.
What there's a shortage of is people who earn enough money to be able to afford that. I just spent the morning as a volunteer at St. Peter's Kitchen, which is this wonderfully organized service that provides meals for 200-300 families every single day. People file through there and they get a really decent meal. And then over the weekend, they get a bag of food, of snacks that they can take home to eat over the weekend. And they also have the choice of food from the pantry that St. Peter's has assembled, so they can take home supplies that they need. It's beautifully organized and treats people with great respect, and also tries to feed as much locally grown and healthy combinations of food. But we shouldn't need that kind of service. There's plenty of food that if people could afford to buy it, they wouldn't have to go to a soup kitchen, even a beautifully run one.
Mm-hmm. I think sometimes we're misled as consumers into thinking that we need to be using the industrial farming method in order to produce enough healthy food. But it, again, sounds like if a lot of this food is not going for human consumption, we actually would have enough food without the chemical inputs if we were prioritizing hunger and human well-being.
That's right. And more of the healthy food that people eat in this country, the fruit and vegetables, is actually imported from countries where labor is cheaper. And that's really the rub here in this country. In order to take those millions of acres that are growing corn and soybeans and transform them into many smaller farms that produce fruit and vegetables, you would need a lot more people doing that work. And US policy has worked really hard to make sure that we have a steady supply of the lowest paid farm workers possible. Most of the farm workers are either undocumented people, so they can't speak up in their own defense and organize unions or even negotiate for better working conditions, or else more and more they're H-2A guest workers who are temporary workers brought here on a visa, assigned to a particular farm or labor contractor. And they can only work for that contractor, the visa holder. If they cross that person, they go home and they can be banned from the program for 10 years. So there are farms, lovely organic farms, that are using the H-2A program that are bending way over backwards to treat the H-2A workers with respect, to get the same people to come back year after year, to learn whatever languages that those people speak, to visit them in their home, to provide a car, to get them driver's licenses, to provide decent housing. But the underlying unfairness of that system remains. That those workers have to please that employer where they can be sent home.
Mm-hmm. And circling back to your comment on the import of fruit and vegetables from other countries, is that creating imbalance in the food and the fruit and vegetable availability of the country in which it is produced?
Not necessarily. A lot of the companies that are doing that production and sending the food into this country are actually American companies that have relocated. A lot of the production in Mexico is of that kind.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do sustainable or organic farming methods make small and medium scale farms in any way more competitive or more financially secure?
Well, using organic and sustainable agroecological methods makes a farm more resilient to the climate chaos that we are undergoing. It makes those farms more attractive to many people who will make the commitment to buy at a farmer's market, to go to the trouble to do that, to join a CSA, to join a food cooperative, or some of the other independent grocers that try to carry that sustainably produced food. So yes, it does make it possible for a farm to make a living, but unless you sell to the highest markets at the highest price, you're still not going to make the kind of living farming that you can make at most other professions.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the farms, like mine, charge on a sliding scale. So organic farms want to be able to feed people who are from lower incomes. They don't want to just be growing yuppie food.
Mm-hmm. What would you like to see your member of Congress do to help improve farming operations and profitability? Or what barriers to profitability should be addressed?
Well, I would like to see the New York congressional delegation make sure that the money from the IRA that was designated for conservation in the Farm Bill stay as conservation funding, because there are like 3 times as many farms applying for conservation funding as are getting those awards. So the conservation funding for programs like the Conservation Stewardship Project, the EQIP, which is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or through the organic program, those are programs that support farms in improving the environmental soundness of their practices. And so it's important that the Farm Bill support those. It's also important to keep the funding in the Farm Bill to allow USDA to raise the amount of funds that are given out in the nutrition programs. The Biden administration revised the Thrifty Food Plan, and as a result of that, gave millions of dollars in increase in the SNAP payments, EBT payments to low-income families. The GOP leadership in the House and in the Senate would like to take that power away from USDA so that it would be up to the Republicans to control how much money goes to the nutrition programs. And that is a central feature in the Project 2025. If people want to read the article that I wrote about the Stalinesque system that the Heritage Foundation wants to set up starting January 20th, 2025, that will take any efforts towards mitigating climate change out of the hands of USDA, that will end any efforts by USDA to address racial injustice that would reduce that would get more farms using organic programs. Plan 2025 somehow thinks that the Biden administration is forcing organic practices on farmers. And so, since American farmers are already the greatest farmers in the world and produce vast amounts of food, that's what USDA should do, serve them and make sure that as much as possible is exported so that those farms make lots of money. And USDA should cut out all of this baloney about mitigating climate change, helping redress racial injustice, and creating more organically grown food. So we really have to stop that plan from being brought into implementation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when they're talking about the farms that are representing the potential of American farming and greatness, they're talking about the industrial farms, right?
Of course.
Right.
Yes.
And once again, comparing the industrial farming method to an organic or sustainable farming method, will any of the the cornerstones of industrial farming help prevent soil erosion or crops from being washed out due to rainstorms or any of the other weather uncertainties that farmers are facing today?
Well, farms, industrial scale farms that use reduced tillage do improve the amount of organic matter in the top 6 inches of the soil. So that is incrementally better. But in the long run, using chemicals like glyphosate, they are killing the microorganisms that keep the soil, that give the soil tilth, that make the soil increase in organic matter, increase in the amount of carbon that's in the soil. And that makes the soil more of a sponge so that it holds more water, up to 25,000 gallons per acre for every 1% of organic matter that's in the soil, and that reduce the erosion that takes place. So the Rodale Institute, that's been comparing organic farms with conventional farming practices for 30 years, does find that the conventional methods can outproduce the organic when conditions are great. But if there's a drought, if there's a flood, the organic farms will produce more.
Mm-hmm. I know you have a background in Russian history and literature, and I'm wondering if you could explain what you mean when you say the Project 2025 plan is Stalinesque.
Oh, good question. Well, under the leadership of Stalin, the Russian government had representatives of Stalin's party or his faction of the Communist Party in every department, watching the behavior of everybody else and making sure that they towed the line, that they were obedient to the hierarchy and to the leadership. And that is what the Heritage Foundation would like to set up in the United States government, to reduce the number of, it's something like 2 million people who work for the government who are not political appointees, who are experts in whatever field that they're in, that they pass qualifying examinations and they become scientific advisors or whatever it is they do in the government. And what Plan 2025 would be reduce the number of civil servants and replace them by political appointees. And they're now trying to train something like 50,000 of these people who will then be placed as the leaders in all of the departments of government, making sure that those departments adhere to the wishes of the top. So that is a Stalinesque plan.
Thank you. So in this interview series, we've talked to family farms and small and medium-sized farmers and ranchers across the United States. By all accounts, farmers and ranchers are facing challenges with inconsistent weather patterns, water issues, either too much or too little, pests moving into new regions, and the need to remediate past environmental damage so that the land can produce healthy food and an abundance of food. And we've heard some incredible success stories. You are a member of the Northeast Organic Farming Association, or NOFA, Interstate Council, which is tasked with addressing the collective concerns of farmers within the 7 state chapters of NOFA. So you're hearing from farmers every day. What are some of the issues that small to medium-sized organic farms are facing in the Northeast?
Well, farmers are facing all the same problems that other farmers are facing, the problems of prices that aren't high enough to cover their costs, and the chaotic weather, so that there is no longer a pattern to the weather that used to exist when I started farming. So farmers have to be incredibly flexible and nimble in adjusting their plans for every year and every season, every week, because you don't know if you're going to be hit by a huge deluge. So farms need support in investing in more greenhouses and hoop houses. They need support for the conservation practices that help them build healthy soil that has more organic matter, that's more resilient, as I discussed earlier. There needs to be support for more infrastructure, because what the big boys have done is they've taken over the processing. So where I live in Wayne County, there are a lot of empty processing plants that used to be locally controlled, and now that processing is done somewhere else. So there's an inadequate number of slaughterhouses and meat processing, grain processing, things like that, that make it easier to build a local food system that can produce food as close as possible to where people are living. So to cut out the emissions that happen when you have to transport food long distances, and that also make that community more resilient because it can count on getting food from its own area. Of course, we have to maintain links between communities. We can't count on my farm not being the one that's flooded out. So I need your farm, which might be 10 miles away, to help me out, and vice versa. But maintaining that kind of interdependence is really important while we build up as much of the local infrastructure and production as we can. They're wonderful jobs for a few million people growing food in this way. It's incredibly satisfying being a full-time scientist going out and observing and studying what's going on and figuring out solutions to those problems every day, and feeding people, especially if you can get to know who it is you're feeding, who are so appreciative for the high quality food that you can produce for them.
I think you touched on this a little bit already, but are the farmers that you work with using any of the USDA federal or state programs to support or augment their participation in regenerative or sustainable agriculture practices, and which programs are most impactful for their work?
Well, as federal programs go, I think I mentioned the Conservation Stewardship Program, which will actually make like a 5-year contract with a farm and pay them for good practices that they are already using. So the conservation stewardship will pay for cover crop seed and planting trees along streams and things like that, that make a farm more resilient and that produce more carbon. In New York State, we're very fortunate to have a couple of years ago passed the Soil Health and Climate Resilient Farming Act, which increased the funding dramatically for the soil and water conservation districts, which have the Agricultural Environmental Management Program. Farms that sign up for that program then qualify to apply for climate resilient funding grants. So the amount of money for those grants has increased dramatically, and a lot more farms, and organic farms included, are getting those grants that cover making the farms more resilient.
Do these programs help farmers meet a particular challenge or opportunity and become more successful and profitable?
Profitable, I don't know. More likely to survive because they are resilient to climate disaster, yes, for sure. And more likely to survive because there are programs like LAMP, which are little bits of federal money that pay for improving local agricultural infrastructure. So that go for more farmers markets, more CSAs, more food hubs, improving some of the infrastructure that I mentioned, local meat processing or grain processing. Those are programs that help our local farmers be more resilient.
Mm-hmm. Are there any success stories you would like to share?
Well, one of the things that I've noticed about the best organic farms that I've gotten to know in New York State are that they only ask people to work about 40 hours a week. These are farms that are creating jobs that are livable, that pay people decent wages, that treat them with respect, and allow them to have a life off the farm so that when they come in for their 8 hours of work, they're refreshed and they can really do a good job. The farms that are asking for 60, 70, 80 hours of labor and complain because they have to pay time and a half for overtime over 60 hours, they're making farm work into some kind of industrial horror that should not be necessary in a well-organized farm.
It's very physically difficult too, especially as we're seeing the heat conditions that much of the country is experiencing right now. People are working long hours in very physically difficult circumstances.
That's right. On a smaller farm where there's a variety of crops and a mixture of, say, orchard and livestock and vegetable production, or maybe some value-added products that they make, the work is very varied. You don't wear yourself out doing 14 hours in a row of the same repetitive, back-breaking work. I saw a video recently of H2A workers harvesting. Oh, it was on the National Farm Ministry website. Has a video of farmers harvesting watermelons. So they're picking these huge, heavy watermelons, and one worker throws it to the next, who throws it to the person who's in the truck, who puts it in the truck. And they're doing that over and over and over again. That will wear out your back really fast. On a smaller farm, you might have 100 watermelons for the 100 shares in your CSA, maybe 200, but it's not a 14-hour job. You'll work for an hour harvesting melons, and then you'll do something standing up washing, and then you'll do something else that will break up your day and make it easier on your body.
Some legislators wish to take the $20 billion in conservation agriculture funding in the IRA and use it for other Farm Bill purposes. Do you have any thoughts about the potential impacts of repurposing that funding?
Well, that will take the money away from the conservation programs that are underfunded at this point and that should be expanded, and that are the key to making farming all over this country more climate resilient. So taking that money and putting it in the hands of the biggest farmers, adding it to the price supports that the sugar producers or the cotton growers are getting, limits the use of that money to a very small percentage of the farms and misplaces the use of that money. That's not where taxpayer money should go.
And in the article which you shared, which we'll definitely put in the episode notes for this, I think you mentioned that something, what was the number of farms lost? I have the article here, but the 5 million farms have gone under. You mentioned
it's
in
probably
this
more than that in the course of my lifetime. We've gone from over 7 million farms at the peak in the 30s to under 2 million now. So some of those farms have gone out of business because perhaps the people died or weren't really very good farmers. But most of those farms have gone out of business because the prices do not cover the costs of production, because there isn't a good way of bringing new people into farming, because Indigenous people and people of color don't have access to land and to the resources that you need to run a farm. So all of that really has to change. We have like 2 million farm workers in this country, over half of them undocumented people. Many of those farm workers would make excellent farmers. And there are several programs of groups of farm workers who have created cooperative farms so that they can use their skills to grow food and benefit from the sales themselves instead of working for somebody else. So those people are the source of a whole new generation of farmers in this country, if we can provide them with the resources to do that.
And the agricultural knowledge that could be lost if we're not supporting farms of those scales and using that kind of expertise.
Yeah, in New York, there's the Alianza Agricola, which is dairy farm workers in Western New York. Those are highly skilled people who really know how to raise animals. They could certainly run farms themselves, and they would love to have a cooperative. I hope that they will get the funding to do that. There's an effort by Agrarian Trust and some work by American Farmland Trust to see if we can find a piece of land for them so that they could realize the cooperative that they dream of. They certainly have the skills to do it.
I just quickly want to mention too that we recently talked to some farmers and ranchers who are growing animals for meat processing, and the loss of infrastructure, or I should say the lack of infrastructure that is available to them, has been very prohibitive in their work and their being able to run the farm as they would like. So putting that money, or preserving the money in infrastructure to support small farms and ranchers, seems to be very critical at this moment.
Now, among the people who will listen to this program are probably many vegans who hold the position that we need to eliminate the consumption of meat altogether. But from the point of view of small-scale farmers, raising some animals is a major contribution to the fertility of the farm and to the financial viability of the farm by having a variety of crops. So ending all livestock production is throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Eating a small amount of high quality, meat is quite different from the kind of industrialized meat production that we have in this country, and the huge amount of meat that people are currently eating, meat that is not healthy for the people who eat it. And it's a horrible life for the animals that are raised in those industrial conditions.
Across your leadership positions, you have expertise on issues like food access, fair trade, protections for farm labor, which are all critical areas to be addressed in farm policy. But focusing for a moment on healthy food access and nutrition spending in the Farm Bill, I'd like to ask you about legislators working to reduce the amount of spending for domestic food assistance through programs like SNAP in the 2024 Farm Bill. This would obviously negatively impact access to healthy food in the United States, but how would that also change in investment also financially impact small and medium-sized farms and ranches?
Well, if you go to any farmer's market, you will be aware that many of the purchases are made with SNAP. And in quite a number of states, there are double up bucks programs. So if the SNAP coupons are used for healthy food, they will get $2 for every dollar that they spend. And that money spent for local farm product is a very important market for a lot of family scale and community-based farms.
And how does the Supplemental Nutrition Access Program, or SNAP, help to bring food into areas that are often underserved for healthy food choices, such as rural areas, especially through the support of local distribution networks like farmers markets? Again, you've touched on this a bit, but just to focus in on the farmers markets for a moment.
Well, there are food apartheid areas, both rural and urban in this country. There are far too many zip codes that lack access to a really good grocery store or a vibrant farmer's market, particularly one that runs year round. In Rochester, we have the Brighton Farmers Market, which goes year round. It's very expensive to shop there. On the other hand, you get the highest quality food that you can imagine. Mm-hmm. Take a market like that and put it in a low-income neighborhood with adequate SNAP payments and double up bucks, and you could really change the food security picture. But that doesn't exist in many rural and urban areas. So it's not just the SNAP program itself. It's the need for support for low-income people to have the money to buy the food that they need. Like the people today who came to St. Peter's Kitchen. It was a mixture of very different kinds of people. Some of them homeless, some of them people who are regular, who come particularly the end of every month when they run out of the money on either their nutrition payments or their Social Security. There are quite a few little old ladies who are probably struggling to live on very skimpy Social Security payments that may be all that they have to support them. So they need those SNAP payments and they need those soup kitchens. Mm-hmm. It's scandalous that a country that has the potential for growing as much food as we have, in an area like Rochester, where there's so much excellent food produced, incredible apples and fruit and vegetables and grains, that anybody should be hungry. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate you mentioning seniors as well. You're often thinking about families and small children, but seniors also have, as you mentioned, perhaps a limited budget for food. And if costs are fluctuating, they can exceed that budget, and people go hungry.
The House of Representatives GOP people are constantly harping on putting these people to work. Make them work if they're going to get SNAP or any kind of nutritional program. Well, a lot of these people have worked. They've worked all their lives. They've worked at very hard jobs and they deserve to be retired, or they are disabled and cannot work. Or their children and shouldn't work. They should be going to school and playing.
Exactly. Would the reduction of SNAP benefits negatively impact domestic food distribution networks in the United States? Can you talk again about the importance of protecting these distribution networks in addition to the major chain grocery stores and so forth?
Well, yes, of course they'd be negative. For farmers markets, for farms that take SNAP payments from people who buy directly from them, for farms that are selling to institutions, that stores that take SNAP payments, those are a really important part of the economics of the way food distribution works now. So reducing that just takes food out of the mouths of people who need it and takes money out of the pockets of farmers who are just barely covering their costs.
Something you mentioned about your business, your previous business, was sliding scale payments. I think you mentioned in farmers markets, and that's a really interesting idea in contrast to the set costs that you find in a large corporate chain where there is no flexibility. But within the farmers market and this alternative distribution system, you have relationships and commitments to community that are worth something, and so they change the pricing structure a little bit.
Now, our farm presented to the members of our CSA what the costs were to run the farm. And we said, we really need this much in order for my partners and me to make a modest living and to cover the costs. But it doesn't have to come from everybody paying the same amount for every pound of food that they get. Some of you among our customers are making way more than others. You could afford to pay more so that others can afford to pay less. And as long as our budget is covered, we're very happy to have that kind of sliding scale. And we instituted that back in the 90s. And there are many CSA farms that do that today. My farm, the court route of piecework still exists with the pickup, which started this week at the Abundance Food Co-op, but now the food comes from Mud Creek Farm. And Ruth Blackwell is the farmer, and she charges on a sliding scale. And she gives some guidelines for her customers to kind of help them situate themselves on the sliding scale. But it allows people who really appreciate the food and who are making a good living to pay really what the food is worth and what Ruth's labor is worth, so that people who couldn't afford it otherwise can enjoy it too.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about farm practices or other topics and concerns related to organic, sustainable, or regenerative agriculture?
Well, I want everybody to pay attention to this next election. It's extraordinarily important. I am not a great lover of either of the dominant parties, but one of them wants to impose upon us an authoritarian order that would really wipe out the progress that we've made in organic and sustainable agriculture over the past 50 years, building local markets, increasing the acreage in organic production. And I don't want to see that happen.
It's been really, really lovely to speak with you today. Thank you so much for your time. Nice to see you.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for your really interesting questions. You make me work hard.
Oh. Thanks for joining us. Links to the interview guests, farms, and topics discussed can be found in the episode notes. The Farm Voices podcast is produced by the Regenerative Agriculture Coalition, a working group of climate reality project leaders and chapter members. Please subscribe to this podcast, leave a review, and share the episode with others. It helps us raise the visibility of this important information, and we greatly appreciate your support. Join us in the next episode for more on the 2024 Farm Bill and farms and ranches practicing regenerative and conservation agriculture methods.